Somewhere in the Canadian Arctic there is a story that has no clean ending. A community of Inuit people, living as they had for generations, simply stopped being there. No note, no signal fire, no message carried to the nearest settlement. Just absence. Boots possibly still inside doorways, food left out, dogs dead in the snow, and graves, some of them disturbed, opened as if whatever happened came quickly enough that the usual order of things broke down completely. That image, a place built for living suddenly hollowed out, is one of the most unsettling things a human mind can sit with, because we expect places where people live to carry some trace of departure, a goodbye, a direction, something. But this one apparently offered almost nothing, and the nothing has echoed for over a century. This is a mystery that sits at the edge of what we can actually verify. Versions of the story have been passed around in books, newspapers, documentary scripts, and late-night conversations for generations. Each retelling adds a detail here, softens one there, and somewhere in all of that the actual historical record gets harder and harder to find. So here's what this is going to be. A serious attempt to chase the documented facts, sit honestly with what remains genuinely unknown, and resist the temptation to make the story tidier than it actually is. Because the real version, the one with gaps and contradictions and unanswered questions, is somehow more disturbing than any clean explanation could ever be. Here's what we'll be working through. Who were these people, and what did life actually look like in that settlement before it went quiet? Who first reported finding it empty, and what exactly did they say they saw? What do the physical clues, the dogs, the graves, the belongings left behind, actually suggest when you think about them carefully instead of just reacting to them? And then the bigger questions underneath all of that. Was this a tragedy that unfolded slowly, invisibly, through disease or starvation? Was it something that happened fast? Was it a decision, a desperate collective choice made under pressure no outsider fully understood? Or is some part of what we think we know about this story simply wrong? Those questions are going to pull us forward through everything that follows, and I'll tell you now, some of them have answers, partial ones at least, built from records and research and testimony. Others don't. And the ones that don't are the ones that tend to stay with you. People disappear from history all the time, usually slowly, usually in ways that get explained eventually. But an entire community, in a specific place, at a specific moment, leaving behind enough to prove they were there but not enough to explain where they went, that's a different kind of disappearance. That's the kind that lodges somewhere in the back of your thinking and doesn't fully leave. Before we get into any of it, I want to know where you're listening from and what time it is there right now. Seriously, drop it in the comments. There's something about a story like this, about people vanishing in the cold at the top of the world, that feels different depending on whether you're hearing it at noon in a sunlit city or at 2 a.m. in a dark room somewhere. I read every single comment. It's one of my favourite things, seeing Tokyo in the morning and Texas at midnight all in the same thread. So tell me where you are. Now, the Arctic, the early 20th century, and a village that, by all accounts, did not say goodbye. The Canadian Arctic is not a backdrop. It is a participant. Every decision made by every person living there, what to eat, where to sleep, whether to stay or move, is shaped by an environment that operates on terms it never negotiates. Temperatures that drop low enough to kill exposed skin in minutes. Darkness that lasts for months. Sea ice that appears solid and then isn't. Wind that can erase a trail so completely that a person who walked out 50 meters from their door cannot find the way back. To understand how an entire community could vanish, you first have to understand that in this part of the world, the margin between ordinary life and catastrophe is unusually thin, and the gap between those two things can close without warning. The settlement in question sits in the Kivalliq region, the area west of Hudson Bay in what is now Nunavut. It is a place of staggering distance from almost everything. The nearest administrative centre was hundreds of miles away. The nearest hospital might as well have been on another planet. Communication in the early 20th century meant either a telegraph station you had to physically travel to, or waiting for whoever happened to pass through, which might be months. This is not isolation the way we casually use that word. This is a structural condition that shapes everything, including what it means for a settlement to go silent. Here is something that matters enormously to this story, and gets lost in almost every retelling. In the Arctic, communities moved. That was not a sign of crisis. That was the logic of survival. Inuit groups organised their lives around seasonal resources, following caribou herds inland in summer, relocating to coastal ice for seal hunting in winter, shifting camp when the animals moved or the ice changed or the weather forced a decision. A settlement that looks abandoned to an outsider's eye might simply be a place where people were at a different time of year. The difference between a permanent settlement and a seasonal camp is not always obvious from the outside, especially if you don't know what you're looking at or when the last people were there. Which brings us to who was actually doing the looking. The people most likely to encounter remote Inuit communities and report on them were a fairly specific group. Royal Canadian Mounted Police officers patrolling vast territories on irregular schedules, missionaries moving between communities, often on foot or by dog sled, covering enormous distances over the course of a year, fur traders whose circuits might bring them to a particular location once a season, sometimes less, and occasionally explorers or surveyors passing through regions that most of the world considered blank space. These were not neutral observers. Each of them carried assumptions, agendas, and frameworks for understanding what they saw. A missionary and a police officer looking at the same empty settlement would likely reach for completely different explanations, and neither of them might think to ask the questions that would actually matter. Now factor in the distance between observation and record. Someone encounters something unusual. They travel hundreds of miles to report it. The report gets written down by someone else, filtered through institutional language, possibly weeks or months after the original encounter. Then it gets picked up and repeated, and somewhere in that chain, the careful hedging tends to fall away, and the most striking elements tend to expand. An officer who wrote that the settlement appeared to have been abandoned and that he could not determine when or why becomes, in later retellings, a man who stumbled on a ghost town with food still warm on the table. That pattern of amplification is not unique to this story, but this story is particularly vulnerable to it because the actual documented record is sparse, and sparse records create space that imagination fills in. What we need to do, then, is work carefully back through that amplification toward whatever was actually observed, and to do that we need to first understand who the people were and what their lives actually looked like in that settlement before whatever happened. The people living in and around that settlement were not a mystery to themselves. They had names, relationships, histories, obligations. They operated within a social framework that had been refined over centuries of Arctic life, and that framework was sophisticated in ways that outsiders rarely recognized and almost never accurately described. Inuit social structure at this time was built around the family group as the primary unit of survival. Not the nuclear family in the way a Southern Canadian or European observer would have understood it, but something more extended and more flexible. A household might include grandparents, adult children, their spouses, cousins brought in during hard times, older relatives who could no longer hunt but whose knowledge was worth more than their caloric cost. These groups were not fixed. They were porous. People moved between them based on need, kinship obligation, marriage alliance, and the practical logic of who had food and who didn't. A family that had a good hunting season was expected to share, not out of sentiment, but because survival was understood as a collective project. The person you fed in January might be the person whose dogs pulled your sled to safety in March. Decision-making worked through consensus rather than hierarchy, at least in the way hierarchy was understood in European administrative culture. Experienced hunters carried authority because their judgment had earned it, not because any formal structure had conferred it. An elder's opinion on ice conditions or weather patterns was not advice you ignored lightly, because the accumulated knowledge embedded in that opinion represented the survival intelligence of multiple lifetimes. When the community needed to decide whether to move camp, when to begin a particular hunt, how to respond to an unusual situation, those decisions emerge from conversation, from deference to demonstrated competence, from a reading of shared conditions that everyone understood because everyone was living inside them. The rhythms of subsistence were tied to the land and water in a way that made the calendar feel almost irrelevant. What mattered was not the month, but the condition. When the caribou moved, you moved. When the sea ice reached a thickness that would bear a hunter's weight and a sled's load, you relocated to the coastal hunting grounds. Summer meant fishing, caching, laying in stores. The cache sites, often marked in ways only community members recognized, were not just convenient storage. They were insurance, distributed across a landscape so that no single disaster could wipe out everything at once. Losing one cache to flooding or scavenging animals was a setback. Losing all of them was death. So they were spread deliberately, the same logic of distribution that governs any resilient system. The sled dogs were not peripheral to this. They were structural. A team of well-maintained dogs meant the difference between reaching a hunting ground and not reaching it, between getting an injured person to help and watching them die, between outrunning a weather system and being caught by it. Dogs required food, which meant every hunt had to account for feeding the team as well as the people. They required management, because a poorly maintained team was unreliable in exactly the moments reliability mattered most. The care of the dogs was not a secondary concern. It was embedded in the planning of everything else. Experienced hunters knew their dogs as individuals, understood their strengths and their weaknesses, made decisions about travel and load based on what the animals could do. When outsiders later looked at the dead dogs at the settlement and tried to interpret what they meant, most of them were working with almost none of this context. The early 20th century had begun introducing complications into these rhythms. Trade goods had been moving into the region for generations by this point, but the pace and character of that contact was changing. Rifles were replacing traditional hunting weapons in some contexts, which affected how and where people hunted, and created a dependency on ammunition that had no local substitute. Tea, flour, and tobacco had become part of daily life, in ways that meant people now needed things they could not produce themselves. Trading posts had become nodes in the seasonal round, destinations that shaped movement patterns the same way caribou migration routes did. Some families had developed relationships with specific traders, which tied them to particular places at particular times of year. This contact with outside systems was changing something subtle but important. Traditional subsistence strategies had been optimized over centuries for the conditions of this specific environment. They were not perfect, because nothing is, but they were deeply calibrated. The introduction of new tools and new dependencies created efficiencies in some areas, while creating vulnerabilities in others. A community that had come to rely on a particular trade good, on a trader who came at a predictable time, on a route that assumed certain ice conditions, was a community that had new ways to be caught out when conditions changed unexpectedly. And here is the thing outsiders consistently failed to understand. When they encountered Inuit communities, they were usually seeing a snapshot of something dynamic. A settlement that looked permanent might be occupied only seasonally. A group that appeared small might be a subset of a larger network temporarily concentrated in one location. Signs that looked like hardship might be normal fluctuation. Signs that looked like normal activity might indicate serious distress. The interpretive frameworks these outsiders carried, shaped by European concepts of permanent settlement, linear time, and visible hierarchy, were poorly suited to reading what they were actually looking at. A police officer trained to identify disorder through the lens of settled agricultural society was not well equipped to distinguish between a community that had moved as planned and one that had disappeared under duress. So when the reports began to come in about the settlement on the west shore of Hudson Bay, they were being written by people who were already working with a distorted map. They had some of the facts, but the facts without the context are just shapes without meaning, and the context, the full texture of how these people actually lived, had largely been invisible to the people doing the reporting all along. The version most people hear starts like this. A group of outsiders arrives at an Inuit settlement on the west coast of Hudson Bay. Depending on which telling you're listening to, they're either Royal Canadian Mounted Police, or a single Mountie with a local guide, or sometimes they're a group of fur traders looking to renew their contacts. They come expecting the usual things: dogs barking, smoke curling out of snow houses or cabins, people coming out to greet them, or at least to see who has shown up. Instead, they find nothing. Not nothing as in tundra. Nothing as in a place that had clearly been lived in very recently, but is now completely silent. Food left behind, pots still on their stands, tools lying where someone had last put them down, sleds pulled up as if ready for use, and no people. That's the skeleton of the story as it circulates. From there, the details start to mutate. In some tellings, the man who first sees the site is an RCMP constable named Andrew or Angus, or sometimes entirely unnamed, travelling by sled along the coast. In others, it's a trader, often given a Scottish or English surname, who had regular dealings with the community and knows exactly how many people should be there. He crests a rise, or comes around a point, or breaks through a line of shore ice, and there it is, the familiar camp in the familiar place. But the familiar soundscape is missing. No babies crying, no dogs howling, no chopping of ice, just the wind and the creak of snow under runners. He calls out. No answer. He moves closer, maybe hand on his rifle, because an unnaturally quiet camp in the north can mean danger. An animal, an accident, a fight. He approaches the first snow house or cabin. The entrance is open, or blocked only loosely. Inside he finds bedding, clothing, maybe a seal oil lamp burned down but not cleaned. In some versions there's a pot still full of half-cooked food, frozen in place. In others the story insists that tea was still warm, as if the people had vanished minutes before, though in that climate still warm is more dramatic than plausible. He checks the other dwellings, same pattern, evidence of recent life, no people. Then come the details that give the story its famous chill. Dead dogs, still tethered to their lines, starved where they lay. Not a couple of animals left behind, but a whole team, or multiple teams depending on the account. The harnesses still on their bodies, the snow around them marked by their struggles, and then finally their stillness. Graves, according to some narrators, dug up, not carefully opened and reclosed, but disturbed. Bones exposed. In a few versions, the skull of one body is missing, or placed at a strange angle. In others, crosses or markers have been pulled aside. These are the opened graves that will end up in every retelling, even when the original report is fuzzier than that. And then there are the so-called signs of suddenness. These are the details that storytellers and later writers latch onto because they suggest not a planned move, but a flight. A pot left suspended over a lamp. Knives and harpoons still lying on the ground instead of being strapped onto sleds. Children's clothing left behind. A seal or caribou carcass only partly butchered. A cache opened but not emptied. A rifle, in some versions, leaning against a wall, as if someone meant to grab it on the way out and didn't. You can hear the pattern. Every detail is chosen to imply interruption, a life paused mid-action. That's what makes it compelling. You don't need to know much about the Arctic to feel the wrongness of a camp abandoned in that way. People in environments this unforgiving do not walk away from dogs, from tools, from food, without a reason. But the moment you start asking for specifics, things begin to blur. Who exactly was that first outsider? The story will usually give you a role, a Mountie, a trader, a patrol. But the names shift. Sometimes the year is 1905, sometimes 1930, sometimes around the turn of the century. The number of houses or Inuit changes, the number of people who are supposed to be there changes, the distance from the nearest trading post changes, even the exact location drifts. Some sources say it was near Anjikuni Lake, which is not on the west coast of Hudson Bay at all but inland, connected by rivers and routes that outsiders often mismap. Other versions vaguely anchor it north of Churchill or along the west coast near the Barrenlands. Coordinates, when they appear at all, are approximate or inconsistent. No early police map cleanly lines up with the way the legend places the settlement. And then there's the chain of reporting. Did the supposed discoverer write a report directly to his superiors? Did he tell the story to a journalist decades later? Did it pass from a trader's diary into a magazine article, and from there into a paperback about strange mysteries of the North? When researchers later went looking for the original RCMP report that was said to describe this empty camp, they couldn't find it. The force's own archives did not yield a clean, contemporaneous document that matched the popular narrative. Instead, they found later statements denying that such an incident had ever been recorded, and a tangle of second- and third-hand accounts. What we seem to have, when you strip the story down, is this. At some point in the early 20th century there were indeed reports circulating about an Inuit settlement that had been found empty. Those reports were passed along by outsiders who already misunderstood or only partially understood how Inuit mobility worked. Over time, as they were retold, the gaps got filled with drama. A camp that might have been vacated weeks before becomes a camp left in haste. Dogs that were perhaps culled intentionally, or that died during a hard period and were left in place, become mysteriously starved, still tethered. Graves that could have been opened for perfectly understandable cultural reasons, or by animals, become eerie signs of desecration. The early uncertainties are not just small footnotes, they are structural. We don't have a fixed date. We don't have a universally agreed upon name for the community. We don't have coordinates that everyone accepts. We don't even have a single, stable version of who saw what, in what order, and who they told. And yet, the story spread. It spread because it hit a nerve in two different systems of imagination at once. For Southerners reading about the North in newspapers and magazines, the idea of a whole Eskimo village disappearing with no explanation fit neatly into existing fantasies about the Arctic as a place of mystery, danger, and unknowable forces. An empty camp, food on the fire, dogs dead at their posts. This was Gothic horror transplanted onto snow and ice. It didn't matter that the article might have been light on verifiable detail. It felt right to people who had already been primed by adventure tales and exploration narratives to see the North as a blank canvas for fear. For some Inuit, the story resonated because it echoed things that did happen, if not in quite the way the outsiders described. Camps did get abandoned rapidly when conditions shifted, when game moved unexpectedly, when sickness appeared. People did sometimes die far from family, leaving shelters to be discovered later by others. Dogs were sometimes killed in numbers that would look brutal to an outsider, because the math of survival demanded it. Graves were sometimes reopened for reasons grounded in belief systems outsiders never bothered to learn. The legend fused these two frameworks. It took real anxieties about starvation, about epidemics, about the fragility of life in the Arctic, and wrapped them in a narrative told primarily in the language of southern mystery-mongering. And crucially, it arrived at a moment when the North was beginning to be drawn more tightly into national imaginations. Newspapers were hungry for stories from Canada's frontier. Adventure writers and radio hosts needed material that sounded exotic and unsettling. A report of an empty Inuit settlement, however garbled, was too potent a seed not to cultivate. So the first report, the one we can't quite pin down, did something powerful. It offered a single, vivid image, a place where life had clearly been and then suddenly wasn't. Everything else, the dates, the names, the supposed clues of what had happened, grew around that image like ice crystals forming out of moisture in the air. What we're left with now is not a clean incident to reconstruct, but a layered story to unpack, to get any closer to what might actually have happened, to separate what could be a normal, if tragic, pattern of movement or disaster from what is pure invention. We have to look more closely at those supposed signs of suddenness and ask what they really mean when you put them back into the context of Inuit life, instead of leaving them in the shadowy light cast by southern imaginations. Start with the most basic piece of supposed evidence: things, pots, lamps, clothing, sleds, tools, piles of meat. The legend leans hard on the image of useful objects left where they lay, as if their owners had no time to pick them up. But objects, by themselves, don't have a single obvious meaning. They're like words torn out of a language you don't speak. You can look at the letters, you can notice patterns. But until you understand how that language normally works, you don't actually know what's being said. Abandoned equipment can point in a lot of different directions. If you already believe a camp was left in blind panic, a pot on its stand and a lamp burned down feel like proof. If you know that people sometimes leave specific things behind when they intend to return, they tell a different story. In the Arctic, caches and semi-permanent camps are not accidents, they are strategies. For generations, Inuit families have moved in circuits, returning to the same good seal holes, the same caribou crossings, the same sheltered points along the coast. A place might be occupied every spring, or every other winter, or only in years when ice or animals behave a certain way. When you expect to circle back, You don't drag every last object with you. You leave some things where they'll be most useful next time. A heavy iron pot that took days of trade or trapping to acquire might stay in a place where you know you'll be butchering seals again. A broken sled that still has a few good parts might be propped up, not because someone forgot it, but because someone deliberately cached it for later repair. Extra fuel, some drying meat, even spare clothing can be left where weather and animals are least likely to get at them, in the reasonable hope that they'll be waiting when you return. To an outsider who doesn't realise this site is one stop on a yearly loop, that looks like abandoned camp. To someone who knows the route, it looks like, we were here, we'll be back. And then there's the environment itself. Snow and ice are not neutral backdrops. They're active agents in how a place looks over time. A camp that was carefully tidied when people left it can, within days, look as if everyone vanished mid-task, simply because the Arctic keeps rearranging things. Wind blows drifting snow through open entrances. It fills in small depressions and hollows, burying some objects while leaving others exposed. A lamp that was emptied and set neatly against a wall can be tipped over by frost heave or the collapse of a roof. A pot hung on its peg can be knocked down when the snow it was set into melts and refreezes, twisting the structure it was attached to. Animals are constantly editing the scene as well. Foxes come sniffing around for scraps and drag bits of food, skins, even smaller tools a few meters away. Ravens and gulls pick at anything that looks like meat, scattering bones and sinew. If there's a seal carcass or a pile of cached meat, it won't stay untouched for long. A caribou leg left to freeze on purpose might end up half gnawed, half buried, and then refrozen into a strange tableau that looks like someone dropped it and ran. In wood frame cabins, bears can pry open doors or break windows. In snow houses, roofs sag and collapse as the weather warms or as lamps that were once carefully extinguished leave just enough residual heat to start a slow deformation. A line of mittens set to dry might end up under a drift, while the pot that was put away properly now sits at a funny angle in the one dry corner that survived. Now imagine arriving not hours later, but weeks or months later. The legend often uses phrases like, "It looked as if they had just stepped out." But just in a subarctic winter is a slippery word. Food freezes almost immediately. Footprints and sled tracks can remain crisp for days if the weather stays cold and calm. A carcass half sawed through will look in progress for a long time if the knife marks are frozen solid into the flesh. A southerner used to rot, and insects might assume that anything not clearly decayed must be recent. In -30, that calculus breaks. Time slows for some things and races for others. Organic material freezes in place. Snow structures warp and sag. Wooden poles crack and shift. A camp can look simultaneously new and abandoned, as if the last person walked away yesterday and 10 years ago at the same time. So when someone decades later says, "There was food still on the fire," what do they actually mean? Was there unfired meat sitting near a lamp? A pot containing a frozen stew that had clearly been heated at some point? Or are they repeating a narrative embellishment added by a magazine editor who preferred the word "still" to the more boring "once"? We don't know, because almost none of the early tellings are precise about what was physically observed versus what was inferred. The same ambiguity applies to belongings that were supposedly too important to leave. Why, for instance, would anyone walk away from rifles or knives in a landscape where tools are life? Under what circumstances does that become rational rather than unthinkable? One possibility is that not all the people left together. If some died or became too weak to travel, others might have taken what they could carry and gone on ahead, leaving items with those who stayed behind. Later, if everyone in that second group perished or moved on again without revisiting the original site, an outsider might find weapons or good gear lying near an empty shelter and assume they'd been abandoned in a rush. In reality, they might have been left with someone who no longer used them. Another possibility: trade-offs in a crisis. If you're moving fast over uncertain ice, extra weight is danger. A steel stove or a heavy pot might have to be sacrificed in order to carry more food or an extra child. Families might cache bulky or duplicate items along the way, expecting to return only if conditions improved. Seen without that context, a cache that was never revisited looks like they left things they would never normally leave. but survival decisions are made in real time, under pressure, with incomplete information. What looks irrational in hindsight may have been the least bad option in the moment. There are also cultural reasons some items stay put. Certain tools or objects might be associated with the dead or with a place in ways that make them inappropriate to take. When a person dies, their gear can be deliberately left or placed near their resting area. Years later, when all that's left is a heap of bones, a crumbling snow house and a rusted rifle, it may not be obvious that what you're seeing is a deliberate act of respect rather than careless forgetfulness. All of this complexity, not just the weather and the animals, but the logistics of movement and the weight of custom, gets flattened when the story is told for outsiders. That's where selective reporting comes in. When a police constable or a trader or a journalist describes what they've seen, they are already choosing which details matter. They rarely write down everything. You foreground the things that seem strange to you. You skip over the things that make sense in your own mental world. If you're a southern reader, used to houses that stay in one place for decades, the idea of a whole settlement being empty is inherently dramatic. That drama invites a particular kind of description. You mention the pot on the hook. You mention the dog line. You mention the open grave. You probably don't spend as much time explaining that there were also neat stacks of cached meat, or that one of the cabins had clearly been boarded up from the inside, or that the trail leading away from the site was broad and well used, suggesting an orderly departure. Those might have been there. They might not. The point is, the report you end up reading is not a transparent window on the scene. It's a filtered view, shaped by what the observer noticed, what fit their expectations, and what they thought would interest the person they were talking to. And then that already filtered account is filtered again. An editor condenses a long, cautious letter into a punchy column. A radio host cherry-picks the spookiest bits for an evening broadcast. An author of a Mysteries of the Unexplained paperback decades later lifts a paragraph out of context, drops the hedging language, adds a sentence about still-warm tea because it sounds good, and now you have a story with edges sharpened deliberately for effect. By the time you encounter the legend, almost everything ambiguous has been sanded away. We get a scene composed entirely of signs of suddenness, and none of the counter-evidence that might suggest a slower, more ordinary process. Abandoned equipment becomes a clue to panic, not to planned mobility. Dogs that died become a sign of supernatural terror, not of desperate human calculus. Graves disturbed by animals, or for reasons grounded in Inuit belief, become hints of a curse, not of cultural practice. To get past the legend, we have to keep that chain of selection in mind. We're not just asking what was left behind at some remote camp a century ago. We're asking what details were lifted out over and over to tell a particular kind of story. And once you see that, you can start to ask a harder question. If the mysterious clues are not as unambiguous as they've been made to sound, what else could be going on? What kinds of ordinary, if brutal realities of Arctic life might lie behind them? To answer that, we have to turn next to one of the most haunting images in the whole tale. The tethered dogs, dead where they lay, and the cold logic that sometimes leads people to do that on purpose. Of all the details that get repeated, the dogs are the hardest to shake. People forget the names, they forget the date, they blur the number of houses, the exact location, even who supposedly found the place first. But they remember the dogs, tied up, thin, dead on their chains. It's an image designed to stick in your head. Dogs are the emotional bridge between worlds. To southern readers, they're almost family. To Inuit hunters, they're partners, engines, emergency rations, and guardians rolled into one. If even the dogs are dead, the story whispers, then something truly terrible must have happened. But to make sense of that detail, you have to start with what these animals were in that environment, and how closely their lives were braided into human survival. Dog teams weren't hobbies, they were infrastructure. If you wanted to go anywhere in winter, between seasonal camps, out to a sealing lead, upriver to check traps, you needed dogs. A good team could mean the difference between reaching the next cache and freezing in a storm halfway there. Dogs pulled sleds laden with meat and gear. They helped track and corner game. Their noses and instincts were early warning systems for thin ice and polar bears. Feeding them was a constant calculation. Inuit sled dogs weren't pampered pets with bowls filled on a schedule. They were working animals adapted to long periods of low intake followed by heavy gorging. On good days, after a successful hunt, they might be given large, fatty chunks of seal or caribou and eat until they could barely move. On bad days, they might get scraps or nothing at all. People and dogs starved together. Tethering was part of the system. Strong dogs will fight. They'll wander. In a place where one lost dog can mean a broken team and a lost season of travel, tying them is not cruelty, it's risk management. Lines were set out near the settlement, often radiating from a central anchor. Dogs were kept apart enough to limit fights, but close enough to reach sheltering snow walls or a bit of windbreak. In storms, some might be loose to find their own hollows, others kept tied so the team didn't scatter beyond recovery. Puppies or especially valued animals might sleep closer to people, even inside shelters, so when we hear about tethered dogs found dead, we're not hearing about something unusual by itself. Dogs tied near a camp is exactly what you'd expect in almost any functioning winter settlement. The haunting part isn't that they were tethered, it's that, according to the legend, nobody came back to feed them. That fact, if we assume it's a fact and not an embellishment, can point in multiple directions. Start with the most straightforward scenario. People left intending to return, and they were delayed longer than they planned. Maybe they went out for what was supposed to be a short trip, a hunt to intercept migrating caribou, a journey to trade at another camp, a move to a nearby spring sealing site, leaving some dogs as spares, or too young or too old to work. You tie the animals, expecting you'll be back in a few days with more meat. You've done this before. It's part of the rhythm of life. Then something goes wrong. A storm drops in fast and stays. A lead of open water opens unpredictably along your route. The ice you used last year doesn't form the same way this year. Someone gets injured, and the pace slows to a crawl. Sickness sweeps through the group. Days stretch. Rations dwindle. Calculation after calculation gets made, none of them including an easy return. In those circumstances, dogs back at the original site aren't forgotten. They're simply unreachable. By the time anyone from the outside world shows up weeks or months later, those animals are dead where you left them. The ropes and stakes that once signalled organisation now read as abandonment. Another possibility is harsher. Sometimes people do leave dogs to die on purpose. That sounds monstrous from the perspective of someone whose worst winter experience is a delayed grocery delivery. In an environment where energy is the only real currency, it is a grim arithmetic problem. Dogs eat meat. A lot of it. If a hunt has failed repeatedly, if sea ice conditions have cut off your usual routes, if an epidemic has reduced the number of able-bodied hunters, maintaining a full team can become impossible. Every pound of food given to an animal is a pound not eaten by a child or not reserved for the next desperate day. In historical accounts from across the Arctic, there are recorded moments when people, facing severe scarcity, killed some or all of their dogs. Not because they didn't value them, but because they did. They understood exactly what they were losing, yet they also understood that keeping them alive could doom the humans outright. Sometimes those dogs were eaten, using every bit of available calories to buy a few more days or weeks. Sometimes they were simply released or left on their lines with minimal or no food, a way of letting the harshness of the land make the decision that the people couldn't quite bring themselves to carry out with their own hands. In a story told later, that kind of event easily becomes, the dogs were found starved, without including the desperate discussions that preceded it. There are other routes to dead dogs that don't require either deliberate cruelty or mythic terror. Diseases move through dog populations just as they do through humans. Rabies, distemper, parasites. Any of these can ravage a team. If a sickness was suspected of being contagious, people might avoid direct contact with affected animals, or even hastily relocate to escape what they didn't fully understand but knew was deadly. A camp left quickly because of an animal disease outbreak could look, in hindsight, eerily like a camp left in supernatural fear. Accidents can cascade. A sudden blizzard might force a group to take shelter away from home and then push them on toward a different camp rather than risk crossing back through dangerous conditions. Thin ice that cracks under a loaded sled could swallow not just gear, but the ability to travel at all, stranding people with only the dogs they have on hand and no safe way to return for the rest. In those scenarios, dogs at the original site die not because anybody fled in panic, but because any effort to save them would have been suicidal under the conditions of that particular week or month. Now layer on top of this an outsider arriving long after the fact. Picture a policeman, or a trader, or a missionary cresting a rise and seeing lines of dog skeletons or frozen bodies near empty houses. They don't know the exact sequence of storms that winter. They don't know that a boy that interpretation writes itself, especially for an audience that already half expects strange northern mysteries. A magazine version of that scene doesn't explain that sled dogs were sometimes culled in late spring when travel needs dropped and hunting was poor. It doesn't talk about the known practice of tying spare dogs at satellite sites as a living cache for future teams. It doesn't mention that a certain amount of dog mortality was tragically normal in years when ice conditions were bad or prey scarce. Instead, it compresses all that messy context into a single resonant image. Lines of dead dogs. Proof that something unspeakable drove an entire community away. And because dogs evoke empathy so easily, that image does a lot of emotional work for the story. You don't need elaborate explanation. Your mind fills the silence between those bones and those empty houses with whatever horror feels big enough to justify it. The real weight of the dog detail lies there, in that emotional gap. If the villagers killed or left their dogs because of famine, that points toward one kind of slow, grinding catastrophe. If disease among the animals or among the people forced a rapid move, that points toward another. If they intended to be gone only briefly and never made it back, the dogs become tragic markers of plans that failed. The truth might be some combination of all three, or something else entirely. Storms, accidents, illness, human misjudgment. They often tangle together in ways no single narrative can cleanly untangle afterward. What we can say is that dead dogs at an abandoned camp are not, by themselves, a signature of mystery. They are a signature of hardship. They tell us that, whatever happened, the people who lived there were pushed past the point where they could honour the usual obligations to their animals. They had to choose among bad options. The legend chooses to read that as a sign of nameless fear. The lived reality was probably more familiar and more painful. A community caught in the narrow, unforgiving margins of Arctic survival. And if the dogs pull our attention toward that pain, there's another detail that pulls it even harder toward the people themselves. The graves. Because according to the story, the ground around that empty village wasn't just dotted with tethering posts and sleds, it was punctured by opened burials. According to the standard version of the legend, the graves were not just there, they were wrong. You don't just get, there was a graveyard, you get, the graves had been opened, or the coffins were empty, or the bodies were gone. Sometimes it's phrased as if something clawed its way out from below, sometimes as if something came down from above and took the dead away. The details change from retelling to retelling. In one version, wooden coffins have had the lids pried off. In another, stone cairns over the dead have been scattered. In some, there are very clear footprints around each grave, as if someone moved methodically from burial to burial. In others, there are no tracks at all, just the unsettling fact that the earth has been disturbed. It's the same narrative move as the dogs, but scaled up. Dead dogs say, the living left in a hurry. Open graves say, the line between the living and the dead was broken. Whatever happened here was big enough, strange enough, desperate enough that even the resting places of ancestors did not remain untouched. Before we decide what that might mean, it helps to understand what a grave looks like in that part of the world, and how easily it can come apart without anyone intending it to. Burial in the Eastern Arctic is, above all, a negotiation with permafrost. For most of the year, The ground is not ground in the sense a southerner thinks of it. It is a frozen composite of soil, rock and ice, locked hard as concrete down to a depth of meters. You don't just decide to dig a 6-foot hole. In many places you can't dig at all. Historically, Inuit burials tended to be practical, minimal interventions in a harsh landscape. A body might be laid in a shallow depression scraped out in the thawed surface layer during summer, then covered with rocks, stones heavy enough to deter scavengers, arranged in a low cairn. In some communities and some eras, driftwood could be used to frame the space, or to create box-like structures around the remains. Later, under missionary influence, wood coffins appear more often, sometimes set directly on the ground and then covered, sometimes wedged into shallow excavations, sometimes even half exposed but shielded with stones. Clothing and tools buried with the dead varied. A man might be laid to rest with his knife or harpoon head. A woman might have a sewing kit, a swallock lamp, a favourite piece of jewellery. In Christianized communities, crosses might be erected, but the basic material reality didn't change. You were trying to keep a body from being torn apart by foxes, bears, dogs, or the slow mechanics of thaw and freeze, and the ground itself is not a passive background. It moves. Each year, as temperatures rise, the top layer of permafrost thaws and softens. Water from melting snow and ice seeps into cracks and cavities. Then, as winter returns, that moisture freezes again, expanding, jacking stones and soil upward or sideways in a process called frost heave. Over decades, this can split boulders, tilt posts, buckle house foundations. It can also rearrange graves. A coffin that was once flush with the surface can be pushed up at one end, leaving a gap that looks eerily like something has forced its way out. Stones carefully stacked over a body can be lifted and tumbled, especially on slopes where each freeze-thaw cycle encourages slow downslope creep. A skull that was once deep under a cairn can end up weathering on the surface years later, not because anyone disturbed it, but because the boundary between up and down is a lot more fluid in permafrost country than we're used to imagining. Add erosion. Burials are often placed on slight rises, dry, wind-scoured ridges, coastal bluffs, island knolls, partly because they are less snow-choked in spring, partly because they stand apart from daily traffic. Those are precisely the places where wind and water have the most leverage. A storm season with repeated high waves can undercut a shoreline, making the overlying ground slump and sheer. A summer of unusually intense rain can start a gully that chews back into a burial ground, dissecting old graves layer by layer. Seen fresh, those cuts look deliberate. A coffin edge exposed in profile, a tangle of bones half emerged, stones fallen away on one side and still neat on the other. To a visitor not used to reading permafrost, it's easy to say, someone has been digging here. Nature also has jaws. Arctic foxes, wolverines and polar bears are not moral creatures in the human sense. To them, a grave is a concentrated source of calories. If animal access is not perfectly blocked, scavengers will work their way in, pulling at wood softened by moisture, nosing between stones, widening any initial crack. Once one layer has been breached, a whole structure can collapse under snowload or thaw, leaving a grave that looks, at a glance, as if a human being started to open it and then stopped. And dogs, the same animals that appear as tragic victims in our village story, are fully capable of becoming grave robbers in lean times. Historical accounts mention camp dogs digging into shallow burials, especially of children or infants, forcing families to move stones and recover the sites, sometimes multiple times. So when we hear the graves were disturbed, there is a long list of non-mysterious processes you have to consider before you get to anything like ritual desecration or supernatural fear. Frost heave lifting a coffin lid, a spring storm eating a notch out of a bluff, animals prying into the easiest place that smells like fat. That's the natural side. The human side is messier and in some ways more interesting. People do sometimes open graves on purpose. In mission-era Arctic communities, exhumations occurred when cemeteries were relocated, away from eroding coasts, away from new buildings, toward churchyards deemed more proper by visiting clergy. Bodies might be taken from older, traditional cairns and reburied in wooden coffins with new markers. Skeletal remains from scattered graves might be gathered together into a consolidated site. To an outsider who didn't witness those decisions, arriving partway through such a process, or years after, when some graves had been moved and others left, could easily look like half-opened graves abandoned for no reason. There's also the possibility of theft, though within Inuit communities themselves, robbing graves for valuables was generally condemned. Missionaries and traders, on the other hand, collected curiosities with distressing enthusiasm. Skulls, tools, jewellery and carved objects were taken from Inuit graves in the 19th and early 20th centuries to fill museum cabinets in the south. Each such act required disturbing a cairn or opening a coffin. Conflict leaves its marks too. If a feud, a killing, or an accusation of harmful shamanism centred on a particular person, their grave might be targeted later, either to remove objects thought to carry power or to destroy them. Colonial authorities sometimes intervened in older burial grounds when building posts, airstrips or schools, moving bodies without much ceremony. Rumours about these events filter back into community memory as they dug up the old ones, without precise dates or officials' names attached, and then there's simple misreading. Imagine walking through an older Arctic burial ground with southern eyes, wood shrunk and split by cold, nails rusted away so that planks have fallen apart, crosses tilted or toppled, stones dislodged by a century of freeze-thaw. You see scattered bones in the lichen and gaps where you think lids should be. If you already carry in your head a story about an empty village and mysterious disappearances, your brain will reach for the most dramatic phrasing available. The graves were rifled, the dead disinterred, the coffins empty as if something rose out of them. A more accurate description might be an old cemetery affected by time, weather, and animals. But that doesn't sell magazines. To move beyond this swirl of possibilities, you need more than an eerie sentence. Historically confirming a claim like the graves had been opened requires several layers of evidence. First, contemporaneous written records from people who actually saw the site early. Police reports, trader journals, missionary letters, not recollections decades later, not second-hand anecdotes, but observations made close in time with specific dates and locations. Second, archaeological documentation, a survey of the burial area, notes or photographs showing which graves were disturbed and how, lids pried off with tool marks versus boards warped and broken by heave, stones systematically removed versus randomly tumbled, evidence of digging, piled spoil, clear-cut marks in the soil, versus the characteristic patterned movement of frost. Third, some chain of custody for the story itself. When did open graves first enter the narrative? Is it in the earliest accounts, or does it appear only after the tale gets retold for southern audiences? Do Inuit oral histories of that place mention disturbed burials, or is it a detail that lives only in English-language sensational pieces? Without that scaffolding, the graves were opened remains what it currently is, a powerful, unsettling image sitting at the intersection of geology, ecology, colonial history, and human imagination. It might point toward a real event, a relocation that left a cemetery half-moved, a bout of grave robbing by outsiders, a storm season that tore into a hillside and unveiled the dead. Or it might be a narrative embellishment, added because no mystery feels complete without the sense that even the ancestors' rest has been broken. The opened ground tells a story either way. The question is whether it tells us about what happened to that particular village, in that particular year, or about what outsiders wanted the Arctic to be, a place where even the earth itself seems restless and haunted. To sort between those options, we have to go looking not just at bones and stones, but at paper and memory, at how this event, whatever it was, first entered the written record and acquired its name. When historians go hunting for an event like this, they don't start with the spookiest version of the story, they start with paperwork. In theory, something as dramatic as an entire village found empty, graves disturbed, dogs dead, everyone gone, should leave tracks in the bureaucracy of the time. An RCMP constable files a patrol report. A missionary writes a worried letter to his superiors. A trading post manager notes abandoned goods or unpaid debts in his log. Maybe, if the story travels south, a brief item appears in a regional newspaper. Mysterious abandonment of settlement in the north. That's the ideal. You line those documents up by date and place, see which details match and which don't, and gradually the outline of a real incident emerges. You get coordinates, names of witnesses, approximate head counts, maybe even remarks about weather or ice conditions. The legend stops being just a story and becomes something you can point to in an archive. But the Arctic is not kind to perfect paperwork. For most of the period when this mystery is supposed to have happened, late 19th into early 20th century, the Eastern Arctic was thinly patrolled and even more thinly documented. Police detachments were small and covered vast territories by dog team or boat. Mission stations were separated by hundreds of kilometres. Traders rotated in and out, some meticulous with their books, others less so. Paper itself was fragile. Journals travelled by ship only once or twice a year if the ice cooperated. Reports went missing. Boxes got lost when a schooner hit an uncharted reef or a sled went through the ice. Structures burned, taking record books with them. Some collections made it to Southern archives, only to sit uncatalogued for decades. So when you go looking for the empty village, you aren't opening a neat folder labelled with the name of the community and the date. You're digging through overlapping piles of fragments, partial patrol logs, mission newsletters, scraps of correspondence, written in English, French, Danish, sometimes in Inuktitut syllabics, each with their own spelling of places and people, and that's the next problem, names. The village in the story is often called something like Anjikuni or Anjikuni Lake, but traditional Inuit place names for that area aren't spelled or sounded that way. Southern writers transcribed what they heard, then printers and editors changed those spellings again, smoothing them into forms that looked right to English eyes. A single Inuktitut toponym might be rendered 3 or 4 different ways in different documents. Then, when government surveyors began officially mapping the region, they sometimes chose yet another spelling, or a completely different name. A lake known locally by one name might appear on maps under another. A seasonal camp with a descriptive Inuktitut name might be lumped under the generic label of a nearby river, or simply marked Eskimo settlement, as if that were precise. Communities moved too, not just individuals shifting camp with the seasons, but whole residential patterns changing in response to trade posts, missions, and colonial policy. A cluster of winter houses at one bay might, 10 years later, be elsewhere, yet still be referred to by outsiders as the same place. So when a southern magazine decades later says, at Anjikuni Lake, an Inuit village was found abandoned, you have to ask several questions at once. Which lake? Under which name? Which shore? Which camp cluster that year? The Anjikuni on a sensational map may not match any single Inuit toponym. It might be a hybrid, a mishearing, or an editor's guess. This is how multiple real events begin to blur together. You find one RCMP report about arriving at a camp on a lake in winter and finding it deserted with food left behind. Unusual, but not unheard of if people left in haste or were taken elsewhere. You find another, years later and hundreds of kilometres away, mentioning dead dogs tied to posts outside another abandoned site. You find missionary notes about graves disturbed at a coastal cemetery after a year of storms. None of these refer to Anjikuni by name. None describe precisely the full package of the legend, but they rhyme. Each account includes one striking image, the sudden emptiness, the starving dogs, the opened graves. A later storyteller reading or hearing bits of these may not notice, or may not care, that they're about different communities, different winters, different circumstances. He takes the creepiest element from each and stitches them into a single, seamless narrative. The dogs from one report, the graves from another, the unexplained departure from a third. He pins them all to one evocative-sounding lake name, whether or not that was where any of it actually happened. By the time that composite story reaches print, it looks whole and self-consistent. The seams have been sanded down. Location names have been regularized. Time has become vague. Many years ago, in the early 1900s one bitter winter. The sources cited, if any, are hand-wavy. As reported by Northern police, as told to me by trappers, according to the old-timers. Historians trying to work backward from that face a strange situation. There are many shards of narrative in the archives that resemble pieces of the legend, but no single, clear, original report that matches it exactly. Among the most cited candidates you'll hear about a police account of a northern patrol arriving at an Inuit camp and finding it vacated, with indications the people had left for another area, normal mobility, but described in dramatic terms by someone unused to the scale of movement in Inuit life. A trader's reminiscence about coming upon a line of dead dogs outside a long empty site, the animals having starved after their owners moved and failed to free them. Tragic, but again something that did happen in the historical record. Mission reports or anthropological notes mentioning older burial grounds where stones had fallen, coffins had broken, or bones had been exposed by erosion and animals. The opened graves detail, but spread across multiple places and years. Each of these is grounded in an identifiable document, with a date, an author, a location. Each has context and plausible explanations. None, on its own, is a supernatural mystery. Yet in popular retellings, they bleed into each other until people talk as if there was one canonical event. One lake, one village, one patrol, one winter, one horror. There is another twist. Inuit oral histories themselves are often highly precise about places and events. But those accounts weren't what early southern writers were listening for. They came north, primed to hear tales of ghosts, curses, and vanishing tribes, not detailed explanations of how starvation, policy, and weather move families around. So even when Inuit elders did talk about a community that relocated suddenly, or a disastrous hunting season, the parts that fit southern expectations, strange lights, unusual dreams, unsettling omens, were more likely to be recorded and amplified. Translation adds yet another layer, a phrase that in Inuktitut may mean the camp was suddenly empty when we went back, could be rendered into English as they disappeared without a trace. A description of a wind-scoured graveyard might become, the dead were disturbed. You can see how, line by line, a practical account of hardship and relocation can be nudged toward mystery without anyone setting out to fabricate. Put all of this together and you begin to see a pattern. The mystery is not only in what happened on the tundra, it's in what didn't happen on paper. There is no single, unambiguous RCMP case file titled with the legend's name. No mission circular warning others about an inexplicable vanishing. No government commission convened to investigate. Instead, there is a patchwork. Scattered references to deserted camps, hungry dogs, storm-damaged cemeteries, and families forced to move. There are changing place names, inconsistent spellings, half-remembered anecdotes retold decades after the fact. The silence between these fragments is where imagination goes to work. When we lack a clear chain of documentation, our brains do something very efficient and very misleading. They connect the dots in the most compelling way possible. We fill in the gaps with patterns that feel right, emotionally, even if they're wrong, historically. A handful of ordinary tragedies, dogs left behind, graves exposed, people moving under duress, coagulate into a single extraordinary catastrophe. In that sense, the empty Inuit village is a story born as much from absence as from presence. It arises not because the evidence for it is overwhelming, but because the evidence around it is thin, scattered, and confusing. In the spaces where official records fall away, legend steps in and gives the Arctic what many outsiders unconsciously wanted it to have. A grand, eerie puzzle that resists easy explanation. To see what might actually have happened to the people behind that legend, You have to leave behind the tidy composite and go back to the conditions those records only hint at. The diseases moving silently through coastal camps, the boom and bust cycles of caribou, the years when ice and weather turn familiar routes into traps. Start with disease. Not because it's the spookiest explanation, but because, in the Arctic of the late 1800s and early 1900s, it's one of the most consistently devastating forces moving people around the map. When southern readers picture an Inuit camp, they tend to imagine isolation as protection. A few snow houses or sod dwellings on a windswept shore, days away from the nearest neighbour. In that mental image, germs seem like a problem for crowded cities, not for scattered families under an open sky. The reality is almost the opposite. For most Inuit communities, meaningful outside contact came in sudden, intense bursts. A ship arrives after months away, bringing a cargo of flour, ammunition, cloth, and influenza. A patrol sled pulls into camp with tobacco, mail, and a cough that didn't start there. A missionary comes ashore, shares tea and stories and hymns, and leaves behind something he did not intend. Measles, tuberculosis, or some smaller respiratory infection that, in a population with little prior exposure, hits like a hammer. You see that pattern again and again in the historical record. In the late 19th century, waves of influenza rolled up the Labrador coast, carried by visiting ships and shore parties. Mission journals talk about entire communities being laid low, hunters too sick to travel, children dying of pneumonia complications. In the Western Arctic, accounts from the early 20th century describe tuberculosis spreading along trade routes, lingering in poorly ventilated mission schools, claiming lives slowly, then suddenly, when a weakened body met a harsh winter. When the great influenza pandemic of 1918 to 1919 reached the north, it found exactly the conditions it needed to be catastrophic. Small, tightly knit winter households, long stretches indoors with shared air, and immune systems that had not been primed by previous mild waves. In some Alaskan communities, mortality rates reached 50, 60, even 90%. Homes were left with no one standing. In some places, survivors consolidated into new settlements because their own villages were simply too empty to sustain themselves. Stories from those years are full of images that sound like horror fiction, but are completely real. Dogs howling outside houses where everyone inside is dead. Children trying to keep fires going over the bodies of their parents. Burial crews working until they collapse, then being buried themselves. Now, compare those images with the core beats of the Anjikuni legend: an empty village, dead dogs, disturbed graves. You don't have to force the analogy. It's already there. Influenza and tuberculosis aren't the only culprits. Whooping cough, measles and other childhood diseases that southern populations treated as a grim but ordinary part of life could be genuinely novel in some Arctic communities when they first arrived. An infection that gives most adults in a city a miserable week could kill a large fraction of children in a camp that has never seen it before. And the way disease changes behaviour is exactly the kind of thing that creates stories of disappearance. Imagine you're living in a cluster of winter houses on the shore of a lake. Over the past week, a few people have developed fevers. One elder is coughing up blood. A child dies in the night. Nobody is quite sure why, but everyone knows one thing with absolute clarity. Being inside those houses where the sick are, breathing that air, is dangerous. You don't need germ theory to recognize a pattern. Inuit knowledge systems long before contact were acute observers of cause and effect. What foods made people ill, which wines brought bad weather, which hunting grounds led to accidents. When a cluster of deaths follows the arrival of an outsider, a ship, or even a particular wind, the lesson is straightforward. Avoid whatever seems connected to the sickness. The response is often movement. People take their remaining belongings and leave, not gradually, not over a season, but in a compressed burst once it becomes clear that staying and dying might mean the same thing. They may go to relatives in another camp, or to a mission station rumoured to have medicine, or they move inland to hunting grounds where, if nothing else, they are away from the place they now associate with death. If somebody from the outside arrives after that point, what do they see? They see houses with bedding still inside, cooking pots hanging, caches only partly emptied. They see dogs tied up, some dead, some dying, because the people who left didn't have the time, the strength, or maybe even the physical ability to go around untying every animal. They may see hastily covered graves, or bodies under snow, where the living ran out of energy for proper burial. To the newcomer, especially one unfamiliar with how fast Inuit families can mobilize when they decide to relocate, it looks like an abandonment. Sudden, eerie, without obvious signs of violence. Add a few months of freeze and thaw, and the graves may look disturbed. Wood shrinks and warps. Foxes dig. Wind scours away covering snow and soil. Bones appear on the surface. A patrol arriving then reports coffins broken open, skulls visible, remain scattered. From that point on, the story can develop in two separate tracks. On one track you have the written version. An RCMP constable makes a note. Arrived at settlement on X Lake, found dwellings vacant, dogs dead from starvation, several graves exposed, believe inhabitants left for another area. He has theories, but they are just that. He may not know whether sickness was involved. What he records is what he can see. On the other track, you have community memory. Inuit oral histories don't always emphasize the same details a police report does. They preserve what matters socially: who died, who survived, who married whom afterward, whether survivors moved, what warning signs were missed. An elder decades later might recall that many people died of a bad breath disease that winter, and we left that place. We never used that campsite again. It was considered dangerous. Those two stories can run in parallel for generations, never quite intersecting. When a southern writer later goes looking for a mystery, he is more likely to see the bland police note than to hear the elder's full account in Inuktitut. He might hear a fragment through translation. Our people all left that shore after many deaths, and combine it with the constable's brief phrases about dead dogs and open graves. The fear and the logic that drove the move, the lived experience of watching relatives cough themselves to death, could get compressed into a single sentence. The village vanished. It's important to say what we can't say here. There is no single archival document that reads, "Entire Inuit village flees epidemic, leaving dogs to starve and graves half dug," neatly pegged to the lake name used in the legend. There are instead many documents that show disease repeatedly causing sudden shifts in population, and many oral accounts that describe camps being left behind after illness, sometimes with a shiver of remembered dread. Is it plausible that one such event, or several, contributed to the composite story of the empty village? Absolutely. The ingredients match too well to dismiss. Epidemics that make people avoid former camps, dead dogs that nobody is strong enough to cut loose, half-finished burials, and later visitors who don't fully understand what they're seeing. These are historically attested, not speculative. But plausibility is not proof. In some cases, the written reports explicitly contradict the more dramatic versions of the story. They mention abandoned camps, yes, but also note sled tracks leading away, or news from neighbouring groups that the people moved to such and such river. In others, oral history may stress famine or colonial pressure more than disease as the primary cause of a move, even if sickness was present. Still, the fear of unseen danger, of something in the air, in the bodies, in the very houses themselves, runs like a quiet current beneath many northern memories from that era. You can hear it in stories where people refuse to sleep in a certain building after the coughing sickness passed through, or avoid a shoreline where too many people went into the ground. From the outside looking in, that can look like superstition, or fuel a supernatural retelling. They fled a cursed place. From the inside, it is a perfectly rational response to a world where disease arrives without warning and kills in patterns you can observe, even if you can't see the microbes. So when we imagine the empty village, one version, maybe the most grounded one, isn't a community mysteriously erased, but a community that made a hard choice in the face of an invisible threat. They took their children, the few healthy adults, whatever they could carry, and they left. They left before someone from the south came by to see it, ask questions and write things down. By the time the paperwork catches up, all that remains on that lakeshore are clues, silent dogs, wind-scraped graves, an absence that feels ominous because the real explanation, sickness passing from one breath to the next, is harder to see, and disease is only one of the forces pushing people to those kinds of decisions. When the sickness is joined by hunger, when the caribou don't come and the fish are scarce, the pressure to move becomes overwhelming. That's where we turn next. If disease is the invisible force that can hollow out a camp from the inside, hunger is the slow, grinding pressure that shapes almost every decision long before anything looks like a crisis. To understand why, you have to start with a basic fact about life in the Central and Eastern Arctic. People are not living off a stocked pantry. They're living off moving targets. Caribou, seals, fish, migratory birds. Almost every major food source is seasonal, and almost all of them move. The landscape can look vast and empty to a visitor, but in an Inuit mental map it's full of lines. The routes the caribou usually take in late summer, the leads in the sea ice where seals tend to surface in spring, the river mouths where char stack up when the water runs a certain way. A good year is when those lines behave. The caribou herds pass close enough to intercept. The ice forms in a way that keeps seal breathing holes within a manageable distance of camp. The fish runs are on time. In those years, a community can cache meat, blubber, dried fish, rendered fat. Winter is still work, but it's buffered by the surplus from months when animals were abundant. A bad year is when the lines shift. Caribou are a perfect example. They don't just wander randomly over the tundra. They follow broad, traditional migration routes that Inuit have known, tracked, and named for generations. But those routes are not carved in stone. They bend around snow conditions, insect burdens, predators, and, on longer timescales, climate shifts and human pressure. Historical records and Inuit oral histories both talk about years when the caribou did not come. That sentence doesn't mean there were literally no animals alive anywhere. It means the main herd passed far enough away that a camp set up along the usual crossing point saw nothing. Hunters can travel, but there are limits. In deep winter, with short daylight and brutal wind chill, you can't just go 50 extra miles on a guess. In late summer, if you've committed to one river system and the herds swing to another, you may not have the boats or manpower to uproot immediately. When those migrations miss, everything begins to tighten. First, you work through the caches you already have. These might be stone-lined pits, snow-buried meat stores, or elevated platforms where dried strips hang. Caches are the Arctic savings account, built up in times of plenty against the expectation that some years will be lean. If the bad hunting season is short, a few weeks of poor weather, a late ice breakup, those reserves are enough. People grumble about thin stew and smaller portions, but they get through. If the bad season stretches out, the math changes. You start adjusting behaviour. Hunting trips get riskier, pushing into marginal conditions because the alternative is watching children go to bed hungry. People broaden their diet, targeting animals that are normally considered second choice, smaller land mammals, birds, eggs, fish in less productive lakes. Bones in old Camp Middens show this kind of shift. More species diversity, more signs of bones being cracked for marrow and boiled repeatedly to extract every bit of fat. Adaptation can carry a community a long way. Inuit knowledge of alternative food sources and emergency techniques is deep. There are stories of families surviving on boiled seal skin, on fermented stored fish, on the scavenged remains of wolf kills when nothing else was available. But there is a point where adaptation is not enough. At that point, the only viable strategy is movement. This is where famine in the Arctic doesn't look like the popular image of skeletal people waiting helplessly in place. It looks like people making a choice. Stay here and almost certainly starve, or move now, while there is still enough strength to travel, to an area where some relative, some remembered hunting ground, some rumour of better conditions offers a chance. Inuit communities historically did this kind of move all the time, even in good years. Seasonal mobility is built into the culture. Families shift from winter sea ice hunting camps to inland caribou grounds, from spring sealing sites to summer fishing rivers. Sleds and umiaks, later schooners and wooden boats, are not exceptions. They're infrastructure for a life that assumes movement. What famine does is change the tempo and the stakes. Instead of a planned transition in April, with time to repair sleds and redistribute equipment, a failed hunt season in January might force a decision in days. Hunters come back empty-handed, again and again. The snow around the camp is crisscrossed with tracks that lead nowhere promising. Children start asking for second helpings that don't exist. At a certain point, an elder or a head of household says what everyone is already thinking: "We cannot stay here." That sentence triggers a cascade of hard choices, and those choices map eerily well onto the puzzle pieces in the Anjikuni story. Dogs, for instance. In a stable year, dogs are wealth. They are mobility, hunting support, protection. You feed them on scraps, on bones, on whatever lean meat you can't use yourself. In a year when caribou have been plentiful, sled dogs are fat and noisy, a living symbol of security. In a famine year, every mouth that can't directly provide food becomes a calculation. There are documented famines in the Central Arctic where people ate their own dogs to survive. There are also accounts where, facing a move with almost no food in hand, families made the decision to shoot or tie out some of their animals and leave them behind, keeping only a smaller core team that they were confident they could feed on the journey. If you're leaving in a hurry, in deep cold with limited ammunition and fading daylight, you may not take the time to euthanize every dog cleanly. You cut loose the ones you can use, you kill one or two to feed the rest, and you go. The others, old, aggressive, weak, stay tied. Weeks later, someone else arrives. They see dead dogs still on their chains. To them it looks like cruelty, or something inexplicable. Why would anyone abandon animals like that? In the logic of famine, the answer is painfully simple, because the choice was between that and risking the lives of your children on the sled. Caches tell a similar story. When a camp is abandoned under normal circumstances, people strip it thoroughly. Tools, pots, lamps, skins, food, anything that can be moved goes with them. A campsite revisited after such a move looks used but tidy. There are hearthstones and old bone piles, maybe some broken gear, but nothing of obvious value left lying around. In a famine-driven departure, what remains can look almost ghostly. Half-empty caches, because the meat inside has turned or is too small a quantity to justify the effort of hauling it. Sealskins left on drying racks, stiff and unworked, because people didn't have the fat or time to finish processing them. Spare gear abandoned because every extra pound on a sled means more strain on tired dogs and hungry people. Those leftovers become plot props in a mystery story. To an outsider, especially one steeped in southern ideas about property and thrift, leaving food, tools, or clothing behind suggests that people didn't leave by choice. They must have been taken, or they must have vanished. But in desperate moves, choice is relative. You're not deciding between staying and going under equal conditions. You're deciding which losses you can survive. Routes too matter. In oral histories, when people talk about travelling to escape hunger, they don't describe random wandering. They describe known corridors, a chain of lakes, a river system, a coastal arc. They talk about who they were hoping to meet, kin at another camp, a trading partner, a mission station rumoured to have flour and tea. From the perspective of someone arriving later, those routes are invisible. Snow covers tracks. Wind erases trails within hours, sometimes minutes. If no one in the outside party has a relationship with the people who left, no one knows which direction they would likely have gone. Unless another community reports seeing them, the departing group effectively drops off the map. So when a patrol, or a trapper, or a journalist comes upon an empty cluster of houses with signs of haste and hunger, the simplest explanation, they left because they had to, can feel unsatisfying. There are no forwarding addresses carved on the snow, no sign on the door saying "Gone to the coast, food scarce." What there is, instead, is an absence heavy with implication. Abandoned gear, dead dogs, half-used caches, perhaps a grave or two where someone died just before the decision to move. In the narrative world of the South, where sedentary life is the norm, a whole community evaporating between one visit and the next is inherently uncanny. It invites supernatural embellishment. In the narrative world of the North, the same scene might be remembered as, "That was the winter the caribou turned. We ran out of meat. Many dogs died. We went to live with our relatives by the big river. We did not use that camp again." Those two versions of the same event can coexist without ever correcting each other. One becomes a campfire tale about a village that vanished without taking its belongings. The other is a sober memory of famine, adaptation, and movement. A reminder of the thin margin on which life sometimes balanced. And that thin margin wasn't controlled only by animals, it was also at the mercy of ice, wind, and water. When the sea fails to freeze the way it usually does, when storms trap people in place, or cut them off from their hunting grounds, the pressure that hunger exerts multiplies. To understand how quickly that can turn a marginal year into a lethal one, we have to look at the weather itself, the changing sea ice, the storms, and the way the Arctic can turn from survivable to deadly in a frighteningly short time. In a lot of southern ghost stories, the weather is just set dressing, a spooky blizzard, a howling wind, a dark sky. In the Arctic, weather is an atmosphere. It's plot. And not just, "It was cold." It's the timing of a storm, the angle of a wind shift, the exact week the sea ice decides to firm up or rot out. Those details can make the difference between a routine seasonal move and a chain of decisions that ends with people gone, dogs dead, and no obvious explanation left behind. Start with sea ice, because for many Inuit communities it isn't a backdrop, it's a highway. In winter, when the ocean skins over, the ice turns into an extension of the land. Trails run not just across tundra, but across frozen bays, along pressure ridges, out to flow edges where seal holes dot the surface. People know which areas usually freeze thick and smooth, which stretches are riddled with thin spots, which currents tend to break up the ice early in spring, but usually does a lot of work in that sentence. All it takes is one season where the freeze comes late, or the wind stacks the ice in chaotic slabs instead of flat sheets, and the old routes become unreliable. The path that was safe every March for 10 years might be a maze of open leads this time. The bay that normally locks into a solid white plain might stay black and shifting until midwinter. For people who depend on that ice to reach hunting grounds, trapping lines, or neighbouring camps, that isn't an inconvenience. It's a trap. Imagine a small settlement like the one at Anjikuni Lake. Maybe in the fall they've already been thinking of moving. Food is tight, caribou have gone wide, seals have been scarce. But they're watching the weather. The lakes and rivers they'll need to cross aren't ready. The ice is forming, but it's not trustworthy yet. You can't drag heavily loaded sleds over slush and thin crusts without courting disaster. So they wait. Then, suddenly, there's a window. Temperatures plunge for a week. The wind drops. The surface firms up. Trails that were grey and wet yesterday ring hard under a boot or a harpoon spike today. If you've been living on the edge of hunger, that moment is a kind of command. Go now. You don't assume the good conditions will last. The knowledge built into Inuit life says the opposite. Breaks in bad weather are often short. So you do what people in precarious environments have always done when a door opens. You rush through it. Teams are harnessed. Essential gear is thrown onto sleds. You bring tools, clothing, weapons, lamps, children, elders. You probably leave behind things you'd rather take, because every hour spent packing is an hour the ice has to change its mind. From the inside, that departure is completely rational. From the outside, arriving weeks later, it can look abrupt, even eerie. Half-burned seal oil in lamps, a pot still on a shelf, a few stores of meat frozen in place, no clear sign of a long, carefully planned migration. The key is that the plan wasn't about perfection, It was about seizing a narrow, volatile opportunity before it vanished. Now flip the scenario. Instead of a community leaving a winter camp over ice, imagine people travelling on open water late in the season. Maybe they've gone to a coastal trading post, or to visit relatives, or to fish in a more productive bay. They're using boats, umiaks or later wooden craft, to move along a coastline where right now the sea surface is dark and moving. Weather forecasts in the modern sense are not part of this world. There's sky reading, animal behaviour, the feel of the wind, the thickness of frost. Inuit observational knowledge of coming storms can be extraordinary. But even the best hunter can be ambushed by a system that spins up faster or shifts track. You're planning to return to your home camp before the freeze. You've judged, based on experience, that there's still time. Then the temperature drops harder than expected. Winds swing north and drive pancake ice in from offshore. In 2 or 3 days, the familiar coast is rimmed with new unstable flows. Too much ice to push a boat through safely, not enough to travel over with sleds. You're stranded in between seasons. In that kind of shoulder period, freeze up in fall or break up in spring, the environment is at its most treacherous. Water is cold enough to kill in minutes, but the ice hasn't arranged itself into the clean dichotomy of solid versus open. It's slush, pressure cracks, random rafts that look strong from a distance and crumble under weight. If you're on the wrong side of that mess, if the way back to your original village is now a churn of a loose ice and newly forming skin, you have choices, but they're ugly. You can try to force a return anyway, threading boats through flows and hoping you don't get pinned when the wind piles ice around you. You can wait where you are, hoping that relatives at the home camp realize you're delayed and assume you've overwintered somewhere else. Or you can abandon the idea of going back at all and redirect your winter to wherever you currently are, or to some third location that still looks reachable. To anyone who later shows up at the original village, all 3 options look like the same outcome: nobody there. And if people did try to come back and failed, the evidence doesn't arrange itself kindly for investigators. Drowning in Arctic conditions does not always leave a body to recover. A person who goes through thin ice in moving water can be swept under a shelf. A storm can blow a boat and its passengers out into open sea and down under drifting flows. Scavengers, time, and simple logistics combine to erase traces fast. The same is true of exposure. In a freeze-thaw cycle, you can be relatively safe 1 hour and in mortal danger the next. Wet clothing in a rising wind. A sled through a patch of overflow water that soaks boots and pants. A sudden whiteout that erases landmarks and forces a party to stop in the open because they can't see the next snow house, the next known rock outcrop. People are not helpless in the face of this. Inuit survival techniques, snow shelters, layered clothing, fire-starting strategies, knowledge of where to find fuel are all responses to exactly these risks. But remember the context from the last section. Famine and stress erode margins. If you're already underfed, already tired from long journeys stretched by bad ice or blocked routes, your resilience to cold drops. Your ability to make good decisions in a blizzard diminishes. One wrong turn in low visibility, one misjudged crossing, and an entire travelling party can vanish within a few miles of safety. No one is there to watch it happen. No one sees the moment a snowhouse roof collapses or a lead widens just as a sled team tries to cross. What shows up later, if anything, is a few scattered items, a rumour that they never reached the place they were going, a gap in a genealogical chart. When a southern writer hears about an empty settlement with no bodies found, they often jump to the extraordinary. Alien abductions, mass suicides, mysterious mass migrations in the dead of night. But the ordinary in the Arctic can be ruthless enough. Storms can lock a camp in place. Imagine a November gale that arrives just as a group is preparing to shift to its winter hunting site. Wind howls for days, temperatures plunge, snow drifts bury gear. The few remaining windows to move over decent ice close while people are pinned indoors or limited to short, dangerous trips for snow and fuel. By the time the weather clears, the ice is either too broken to cross or too thin to trust. The intended route is gone. If food is short and dogs are exhausted, the original plan to move might be abandoned in favour of a different, less ideal option. Perhaps following a river inland, perhaps walking overland with minimal sled support. Again, from the perspective of someone returning months later, the pattern looks baffling. Why would anyone not use the obvious winter trail over the bay? Why is the camp empty when the pack ice beyond the point looks solid? The answer might be as simple as, because in the narrow, crucial days when decisions had to be made, that trail was a churn of broken floes and black water. What you see in March is not what they saw in November. Rescue and recovery in these conditions are not operations in the modern sense. There is no helicopter with infrared, no coordinated search grid. There are kin travelling their own routes, hearing that someone did not arrive, maybe adjusting their own path to check likely shelters. There are patrols, decades later in some cases, hearing that once there was a camp here and now there is nothing. They find open graves, because frost heave and animals disturb burials over time. They find dead dogs because they die where they were tied. They find houses with some belongings left because people left fast, or because they never came back to a site that had become associated with hunger, danger, or grief. And they don't find the people, because the trail those people took intersected with bad ice or bad weather, in ways that don't leave neat documentary endings. None of this rules out other causes. It doesn't prove that any specific vanished camp was undone by a single storm or a freeze-thaw trap. But it draws a frame around the mystery, a frame made of wind patterns, ocean currents, and the physics of ice. Within that frame, the impossible disappearance starts to look less like a supernatural event and more like what life on a knife edge often produces. Gaps. Stories that fade out between one known camp and the next. Places remembered as abandoned not because people walked into another dimension, but because they walked into weather that did not forgive a mistake. And if the environment can erase a community's trail without malice, humans can do their own erasing with intent. Behind the storms and the shifting ice, there's another category of explanation people don't like to talk about as much. Conflict, coercion, and choices that weren't made freely at all. When Northerners who grew up on these stories get to this part, a lot of them shift in their chair. Because once you admit that the environment can wipe out a trail without trying, you also have to admit the other possibility. Sometimes someone helps it along. In the more lurid retellings of the Anjikuni story, this is where the script jumps straight to murder. A massacre. Raiders from another band sweeping in, killing everyone, driving off survivors, leaving only dogs strangled on their chains and graves ripped open for who knows what purpose. It fits a certain narrative template. People like conflicts with clear villains. But to understand how violence might fit into a story like this, if it fits at all, you have to zoom out from mysterious strangers in the night and look at the actual pressures that were building in the region when these stories were being written down. Because the North was not an empty stage where one little Inuit camp lived in isolation until something unimaginable happened. It was, by the early 20th century, a crowded intersection of power. There were the Inuit themselves, with long histories of alliance, marriage, trade, and occasional local feuds. There were the traders, Hudson's Bay Company factors, independent post owners, competing for furs and loyalty. There were police, first the Northwest Mounted Police, later the RCMP, moving deeper into Inuit lands to maintain order and enforce southern laws that nobody up here had written. Each of those forces came with its own rules, its own priorities, and its own willingness to back those priorities with coercion. Start with policing. When mounted police arrived in new regions of the Arctic, they weren't just walking in with notebooks and curiosity. They were coming with a mandate. Bring law and order, collect information, and make sure the northern frontier looked controlled from Ottawa's point of view. That translated into very specific, very tangible acts in Inuit lives. Police pursued suspects in killings that had taken place decades earlier, in the context of starvation or self-defense, and tried them under Canadian law. They arrested people for behaviour that, within local norms, hadn't been criminal at all. They chased down rumours of cannibalism, witchcraft, rebellion, words loaded with fear in the South and often poorly translated from stories that had different meanings in Inuktitut. When a patrol came into a region asking hard questions, it could fracture relationships. Families who had been involved in a contested killing years before might suddenly find themselves the target of an investigation. People could be pressured to testify against relatives. Communities could be encouraged or intimidated to distance themselves from someone labelled dangerous. If you're in a small settlement and you hear that the police are coming and that they're asking about an incident your uncle was involved in 15 years ago in the middle of a famine, pack up and go somewhere else is not an irrational response. You don't need a gunfight for violence to shape movement. The credible threat of being taken away in handcuffs or losing a hunter to prison is enough. Then there were the traders. In theory, the relationships between Inuit and trading posts were reciprocal. Hunters brought furs, fox, mink, later white fox in particular. Traders provided ammunition, tea, flour, cloth, metal tools. In reality, the balance of power was skewed hard toward the post. A factor who decided a family was unreliable, in debt, or aligned with a rival could simply refuse to sell them ammunition or supplies on credit. In a world where your access to bullets could mean the difference between enough meat and starvation, that kind of economic pressure is a weapon. Trading disputes could create rifts between groups tied to different posts. A camp that traded mostly at one post might be viewed with suspicion by another. Gossip travelled with the same dog teams that moved furs. Somebody labelled a thief or troublemaker at one place could find doors closing elsewhere. Now fold that into local Inuit conflicts that predated all of this. No human society is free of tension. There were old grudges, disputes over hunting territories, sorcery accusations, sudden flare-ups over stolen equipment, injuries, or romantic entanglements. In a small population, the line between our cousins and the people who killed my grandfather can be thin and emotionally charged. Add outsiders who selectively believe some stories, misunderstand others, and write everything down in a language that flattens nuance. You get reports that hint at conflict but rarely show the whole picture. Within that mesh of trading loyalties and police priorities, it's not hard to imagine situations where a particular camp became isolated. Maybe they backed the wrong trader in a dispute. Maybe someone there was blamed, fairly or not, for a violent act. Maybe a police patrol was on its way to arrest a key hunter. In that context, the idea that a settlement might flee in fear or be pressured to move under threat is not outlandish at all. Forced relocations in the north did happen, and not just as slow, bureaucratic processes with paperwork and months of notice. There were situations, better documented a bit later in the 20th century, where officials strongly encouraged Inuit to move to new sites, ostensibly closer to schools, missions, or trading posts. The word encouraged in a situation where the other side has guns, ships, and your food supplies doing a lot of work. Older oral histories speak of boats arriving, and people being told this is where you go now, of communities breaking under the strain of being moved away from their familiar hunting grounds, of hunger and death in new settlements that had been advertised as opportunities. If a similar dynamic played out, even on a smaller scale, around a place like Anjakuni, the aftermath might resemble a mysterious disappearance to someone who never heard the backstory. A patrol arrives at a camp that was supposed to be there. It's empty. Dogs are dead. Graves show signs of disturbance, perhaps from relatives retrieving bones to move them, perhaps from animals. Nobody around wants to explain the politics that led to the move to an outsider who already has a notebook and authority. So how would we tell the difference between a disappearance shaped by coercion and one shaped by weather, hunger, or voluntary migration? You'd look for patterns that extend beyond a single camp. Violence tends to leave ripples. If an entire community was wiped out or driven off by a rival group, you'd expect to see oral histories in that rival group, even if they're framed differently. Stories of a raid, claims of territory taken, songs or place names that hint at a victory, a defeat, or a tragedy. You'd expect, in some cases, to see sudden changes in material culture at neighbouring sites, an influx of tools or personal items from the vanished community, trophies, or shifts in population size that don't line up with known birth and death rates. Forced relocations or fear-driven flights would leave different traces. Administrative records, letters from missionaries or traders noting that the people of X have been moved to Y. Sudden appearance of a new cluster of families in another settlement, with older members who remember coming from somewhere else. Gaps in genealogies that close when you realise two separate communities were once one. On the other hand, the absence of those patterns doesn't automatically clear the slate. The North has seen episodes of violence that were never written down in Southern archives. Fear can silence oral accounts for generations, especially when the people who might be blamed still have power. A community might deliberately stop telling a particular story to outsiders, or even to their own children, because talking about it brings risk. At the same time, the more dramatic theories about Anjikuni, that a whole village was murdered in secret by shadowy outsiders, that bodies were hidden so well nothing was ever found, run into a basic problem. Human conflict is noisy. It creates rumours. It creates offhand comments. It leaks. If you have an event extreme enough to erase an entire settlement through violence, and yet you don't find that event echoing in surrounding oral traditions, RCMP case files, or the long memories of traders' families, the likelihood that it happened exactly as the most sensational version suggests starts to look thin. Which doesn't mean there was no coercion at all. It means that if conflict or pressure played a role, it was probably woven together with everything else we've talked about. Weather, hunger, economic dependency, fear of the law. Picture, instead of a single cinematic massacre, a slower, messier story. A camp already strained by poor caribou years. Tension with a trader over debts. Rumours that the police are coming after someone in the group. A sudden cold snap that opens a narrow window to move. A decision made under layered threats. Spiritual, environmental, legal, economic. You pack fast. You kill dogs you can't feed, because dragging starving animals along will only doom everyone. You disturb graves because you intend to rebury ancestors at the new site, or because frost heave has already exposed bones and you don't have time to repair every burial properly, and then you leave, not as victims of a single act of violence, but as people pushed by a whole system that didn't particularly care whether this specific camp thrived or vanished. That's the darker possibility hiding under the legend. Not just that something terrible happened in one place, one time, but that the forces capable of emptying a village quietly, trade leverage, legal terror, administrative decisions made 1,000 miles away, were not supernatural at all. They were ordinary tools of power, and unlike one freak storm or one tragic winter, those tools kept working, long after the story of Anjikuni had hardened into a ghost tale in southern newspapers. To see that part of the picture, though, you have to step even further back and look at the North as a whole, at how governments began moving entire populations around the map, and how those policies turned real human upheavals into fodder for mystery stories. By the middle of the 20th century, what had once been a loose web of camps, seasonal routes, and long-standing habits of movement was being redrawn with pencil lines on government maps. From Ottawa's point of view, the North was finally becoming real space, charted, patrolled, taxable, governable. From an Inuit point of view, that often meant that places where people had always lived suddenly stopped counting, and new places they'd never seen before became the only ones that mattered. This didn't happen all at once. It crept in through missions, schools, trading posts, and policies that sounded benign on paper. Start with missions. Catholic and Anglican missionaries pushed north along roughly the same routes as traders and police. They built small chapels and mission houses at coastal points, and river mouths they could reach by ship. Those buildings, in turn, acted like gravity wells. If you wanted sacraments, medical help, or sometimes just basic supplies, you went to the mission. If your child died, the priest might insist on a Christian burial in the churchyard, not in your ancestral ground. If you wanted your marriage recognized by the church, something that mattered more and more as the state's reach expanded, you did it there. Over time, this changed where people chose to winter, where they came together for seasonal gatherings, where they expected to find others. Camps that had once been perfectly viable, good hunting, good shelter, found themselves slightly off axis. Not wrong, not forbidden, just less useful, because the mission and the things now tied to it were somewhere else. Then there were schools. In the south, residential schools are often thought of as standalone institutions, but in the Arctic they were part of a broader push to centralize people. Day schools and hostels were set up at certain hubs. The message to parents was flexible on the surface. It would be good if your children came here. They need schooling to cope with the modern world. But under that lay the reality that if you wanted to avoid confrontation with authorities, if you didn't want police or welfare agents questioning your fitness as a parent, getting closer to the school was the path of least resistance. Some families tried to keep moving on the land while sending just the children to school. Others were told in more or less direct ways that it would be better for everyone if they settled nearby. Teachers and officials complained about absenteeism when families left for seasonal hunts. The solution from the administrative side was simple: encourage permanent settlements where schooling could be regular and attendance could be tracked. Trading posts reinforced the same pull. By the 1950s, the Hudson's Bay Company and the independent traders weren't just places to swap furs for tea and ammunition. They were often the distribution points for family allowances, old age pensions, and later welfare checks. If the post moved, the economic centre of gravity moved with it. If the government decided that mail would only be delivered to certain named places, it added another layer of importance to those sites. Combine mission, school, and trading post, and you get a recipe for consolidation. Small scattered camps that had always made sense in a hunting economy, following caribou, fish, seal, were gradually made less practical by a southern-designed service economy that wanted people to stay put. Then, on top of those slow pulls, came the blunt pushes, explicit relocation programs. In the 1950s and 1960s, the Canadian government orchestrated several high-profile moves of Inuit families from one region to another. Some were framed as humanitarian. We are taking starving families from overused areas to places with more game. Others were geopolitically motivated, settling Inuit in the high Arctic to bolster sovereignty claims during the Cold War. The pattern across many of them is disturbingly familiar. Officials arrived, often in summer when ships could get in. Families were told that opportunities would be better in the new place. More animals, more support, maybe a school, maybe better housing soon. The risks were downplayed, the permanence unclear. Sometimes there was outright coercion, threats that if people didn't move, their children might be taken, or support might be cut off. Sometimes there was less overt force but enormous pressure. The people telling you to go controlled your access to food, medicine, and the law. Those who agreed, or felt they had no choice, were loaded onto ships or planes and carried hundreds or thousands of kilometres away. They arrived to find that the promised game was not always there, that the climate and light were brutally different, that their knowledge of the land was suddenly half-blind. Sled dogs starved. People went hungry. Trauma followed. In southern newspapers and government reports, these events were often smoothed into bureaucratic language. Transferred, resettled, assisted relocation. The messy reality of fear and loss behind those words was rarely spelled out. So how does this tie back to a story of an empty village like Anjikuni? Imagine you're a trapper or an RCMP constable used to visiting a particular camp every winter. You arrive one year and it's gone. Tents or snow houses collapsed. A few belongings left behind, dogs dead. No fires, no fresh tracks. If that move had been part of an official relocation, somewhere there might be a thin paper trail, a memo about transporting ex-Eskimo families from one area to another, a line in an annual report, a missionary's letter mentioning that the people from that lake have gone to Rankin Inlet this year at the suggestion of the authorities, but those records, if they exist, are scattered. Some are in federal archives in Ottawa, some are in church basements, some never made it past a field notebook, and many were written under assumptions and biases that made Inuit lives look interchangeable. A camp with a specific name and history might be reduced to a group of natives on a single typed page. On the ground, the story would look very different. To neighbouring Inuit, the camp wouldn't have vanished, it would have moved. They would know the new place, know who was there, visit relatives when weather and resources allowed. The continuity would be preserved in memory, in kinship, in conversation. To an outsider who didn't speak Inuktitut well, who only ever saw that camp at that one lake, the lack of people on the day he arrived might feel like a rupture, especially if nobody around was eager to explain that the government or the mission had nudged, and in some cases shoved people out. Sometimes silence wasn't about secrecy, it was about learned caution. By the mid-20th century, Inuit had decades of experience watching stories they told to Southerners come back twisted in court, in newspapers, or in official decisions. A casually mentioned hunger might be reframed as dependency. A frank description of moving graves, a practice that could be part of respectful reburial, might get turned into desecration or superstition. In that context, saying nothing or saying as little as possible could be a way of maintaining control over your own narrative. Relocation policies also tangled the record-keeping in subtler ways. Families split across multiple new settlements could appear in different places in the archives under slightly different spellings of their names. A government file might list headcounts at one site without ever noting that most of those people had once lived somewhere else entirely. Oral historians interviewing elders decades later might hear "we came from that lake" and have trouble matching that statement to any single official document. When future writers, looking for a mystery, tried to piece the story together using only what existed in English, in formal reports, they found gaps. A camp that appears in one trader's account and then never again. A note about Eskimos removed from their former hunting grounds with no place name attached. Into those gaps, imagination flowed. It's much more gripping to say an entire village vanished without a trace than to say a community was gradually eroded by economic pressure and then encouraged to relocate to a government-preferred site, leaving behind a place that one visitor expected to see occupied. One fits on a sensational magazine cover. The other sounds like policy analysis. And yet, for people who lived through it, the slow unmaking of old camps and the making of new ones was anything but boring. Places where grandparents were born, where children had been buried, where certain animals belonged, were suddenly optional in the eyes of the state. The map that lived in people's heads, dense with meaning, story and obligation, did not match the map on the wall of a federal office. In that mismatch lies the seed of myth. An outsider returns to a favoured trapping stop and finds it deserted. He doesn't know, or doesn't fully grasp, that the absence is the visible edge of a relocation decision made years earlier, influenced by mission priorities, school placement, and trading post logistics. He sees emptiness and infers catastrophe. He tells the story as a warning or as a curiosity. Editors punch it up. Later writers strip away the boring parts, the memos, the policy language, the slow grind of caribou cycles and welfare payments, and keep the one startling image, a village, suddenly not there. Meanwhile, in another settlement, someone's grandmother remembers packing in a hurry when the boat came, killing dogs because there wouldn't be enough food at the new place, leaving some poles, some tools, some things too large or too tangled with the land to carry. She doesn't recognize herself in the ghost story, because for her, it was never about vanishing, it was about being moved. When you set the legend of Anjikuni beside the documented history of mid-century northern policy, you don't get a neat solution. You get a different kind of plausibility. You see how, in a time when governments were comfortable redrawing people's lives on maps, a familiar campsite becoming empty was not necessarily a sign of the supernatural. It was a sign of a system at work, a system that could uproot an entire community and still leave enough ambiguity, enough missing paperwork and untranslated memory for future generations to recast that upheaval as an unsolved mystery. And that's where the story of this vanished village starts to blur into something larger. The way real, painful, thoroughly human displacements get buried under layers of legend, until what survives in popular imagination is not the policy or the people, but the shadow of an empty place. The Anjikuni story that most people know today didn't appear fully formed. It accreted. It started small, with a few lines in newspapers and magazines. A trapper finds an empty camp, graves disturbed, dogs dead, food still on the tables, no tracks in the snow. Those early versions were already shaped by what editors thought would sell. Short, punchy, a little lurid. You don't waste ink in a city paper explaining seasonal migration patterns or the politics of relocation. You keep the parts that feel like a punch in the gut and cut everything that sounds like context. And so the details began to harden. The dogs weren't just dead. They were starved, chained, desperate. The graves weren't just old burials exposed by frost heave or shifting permafrost. They were opened, rifled, emptied. The people weren't absent, they were vanished, spirited away, gone without a trace. Those are powerful words. They pull the reader's mind in a particular direction, not toward hunger or bureaucratic decisions or long-standing patterns of movement, but toward something uncanny. Then came the retellings. Once a story like that exists in print, it becomes a kind of quarry. Later writers chip pieces off, polish them, and set them into new frames. Paranormal magazines, mystery anthologies, paperbacks with moody covers promising unsolved disappearances. Each time, small shifts creep in. Where the first report might say camp, a later writer upgrades it to village. A few families becomes an entire tribe. A mention that the weather was bad that winter becomes the weather was normal, there was no reason to leave. Any hint that people in the region moved seasonally or had been encouraged to relocate gets quietly dropped. It dilutes the punch. The graves and the dogs become narrative anchor points. They make the story sticky. Think about why. An empty village alone is ambiguous. Maybe people left in a hurry, maybe they left in a planned way and just didn't tell the visitor. Maybe they were already elsewhere, following animals or ice. But opened graves? That feels like desecration. It implies malicious intent. Someone, or something, tampered with the dead. It points away from the mundane and toward the sinister. And dead sled dogs chained to their posts. That image does two jobs at once. First, it tugs hard at emotion. Dogs are not just animals in this context. They're partners, lifelines, essential to travel and hunting. To imagine them left to starve immediately suggests catastrophe. What kind of crisis would force people to abandon the very beings that make survival possible? Second, it subtly erases other explanations. If the dogs are dead, we assume their owners didn't plan to return. If they starved, we infer that nobody else came by. That supports the feeling of isolation, of a place cut off from normal human traffic, except real life is messier. In many northern relocations, dogs were intentionally killed, sometimes brutally, because officials banned them as dangerous, or because there simply wasn't enough food at the new settlement to keep large teams alive. In other cases, when people left quickly under pressure, they did have to make impossible choices, knowing some animals would die. Graves, too, don't sit still. Permafrost thaws, ground slumps, wooden markers rot. A grave disturbed by natural processes can look shocking to an outsider who doesn't know what they're seeing. A grave opened for respectful reburial somewhere else can look, in a second-hand retelling, like something far more sinister. Fold those realities into a story already primed for drama, and you get a transformation. By the time the Anjikuni tale reaches mid-century mystery collections, it's no longer just about one lake or one winter. It has quietly absorbed fragments from other events. A herd of starving dogs recorded in one report gets stitched together with a different account of an abandoned camp. A missionary's comment about exhuming remains for Christian burial gets blurred into graves robbed. A story told in one community about a sudden disappearance after a tragic accident finds its way, loosely translated and unmoored from its place names, into an article about some other empty village entirely. Multiple histories, multiple griefs, get braided into a single, perfect mystery. The pattern isn't unique to Anjikuni. Folklorists see it everywhere. Shipwreck stories merge. Ghost sightings migrate from one building to another. A dramatic death in one town becomes, in a few decades, part of the legend of a different place with better tourism potential. The North adds its own amplifiers. For southern audiences, the Arctic is already coded as remote, harsh, and mysterious. Whiteouts, long polar nights, strange lights in the sky. These are ready-made backdrops for the uncanny. Put an empty village into that landscape, and the imagination does the rest. By the late 20th century, as books about unsolved mysteries of the world give way to websites, forums, and YouTube videos, the process accelerates. Now each retelling is only a click away from the last one. Someone copies a paragraph from a 1970s paperback, tweaks the wording, adds a few speculative lines about UFOs or interdimensional beings, and posts it as fact. Another person quotes that version, drops the date, and emphasizes no official explanation has ever been given, even if quiet bureaucratic explanations do exist buried in archives. Screenshots of old headlines circulate without their context. A grainy photo of an Inuit camp from some other time and place is slapped under the title, The Vanished Village of Anjikuni Lake, and over time becomes part of the assumed evidence, even though it proves nothing and may not be related at all. At this point, the story has done something subtle but important. It is detached from the people whose lives it claims to describe. In many versions, no one from the community gets to speak. There are no names beyond the trappers and maybe an RCMP officers. Inuit appear as a collective, a faceless they, who simply vanish to serve someone else's narrative. So what can we actually say if we strip the legend back down as far as possible? There does seem to have been, at minimum, a story circulating in the early 20th century about a trapper or traveller arriving at a familiar site at Anjikuni Lake and finding it unexpectedly empty. Some secondary details, like dogs being found dead or graves appearing disturbed, show up often enough and early enough that it's plausible some part of that happened in some form, somewhere in the region, even if not exactly as later told. We also know from independent historical research that this was a period when Inuit were under increasing pressure to relocate to mission, trading and administrative hubs. Sled dogs were, in some areas, systematically culled or left to die during moves and policy shifts. Graves were at times reopened or left askew because of both natural forces and human decisions about reburial or Christian cemeteries. Put those together, and you end up with a cluster of historically grounded possibilities. A trapper could have arrived after a hurried but very human move brought on by relocation orders, bad hunting, or a sudden opportunity elsewhere. He could have seen dead dogs left behind by people who knew they couldn't feed them at the new settlement. He could have misinterpreted graves disturbed by thawing ground or by reinterment. He could have been genuinely unsettled, told the story with all the emotion he felt, and had that story progressively sharpened by people who liked the chill it sent down listeners' spines. What's speculative, and remains speculative no matter how many times it's repeated, is the idea of a whole community vanishing without a trace, in a way that defies every ordinary explanation. We have no solid evidence of mass footprints ending abruptly, of food on plates frozen mid-bite, of thousands of people disappearing in a single night. Those are narrative flourishes, not documented facts. When you bring the human reality back into the frame, the story looks different. Instead of an eldritch event, you see families under strain, balancing hunting knowledge against changing policies. You see people who might have felt compelled to leave quickly, knowing that an outsider depending on their presence at one lake might come back and find only an echo. You see women packing cooking pots and clothing in a rush, men making the cruel decision to kill or abandon dogs they loved because there wouldn't be enough food, elders trying to decide which graves could be moved and which had to be entrusted to the land. Their experiences don't need ghosts to be haunting. The legend of Anjikuni works so well because it gestures at real feelings: loss, dislocation, the eerie quiet of a place once full of life, while replacing the uncomfortable causes of those feelings with more comfortable monsters, aliens, curses, nameless forces. It lets listeners shiver without having to think too hard about the systems and decisions, many of them made far to the south, that could empty a village in the most ordinary, painful way. Recentering the story means accepting both layers at once. Yes, there is a legend, built and rebuilt through newspapers, paperbacks, and now the internet. A legend about an empty place on a frozen lake where something uncanny supposedly happened. And beneath that there is a record, partial and scattered, of Inuit communities moving, being moved, adapting, grieving, surviving. There are memories of dog slaughters, of relocations, of graves touched and retouched by human hands and thawing ground. There is the basic stubborn fact that for the people whose homes those mystery villages once were, nothing about them was mysterious at all. They knew where they went, they knew why they left. The mystery was not theirs. What turned an ordinary, if traumatic, change into an unsolved disappearance was the gap between those lived explanations and the simplified stories that travelled south. In that gap, a legend grew. And as long as we prefer the legend to the harder, slower truths about policy, displacement and survival, it will keep growing, feeding on our fascination with vanished villages while the actual people behind the story remain once again pushed to the margins. To understand Anjikuni, we have to decide which absence we're really interested in. The absence of bodies in a camp, or the absence of Inuit voices in the story told about them. So where does that leave us? If we strip away the paperbacks and YouTube thumbnails and go back to what can actually be supported, the picture is surprisingly narrow, and at the same time stubbornly blurry. We can say that in the early 1900s, northern Canada was full of camps and small settlements that sometimes stood full and sometimes stood empty, depending on the season, the ice, the caribou, the whims of the fur trade, and the pressure of government and church. We can say that people in the region absolutely did relocate, sometimes by choice, sometimes under duress, sometimes with almost no notice. A place that felt solid and permanent to an outsider could, for the families who lived there, be just one stop in a long chain of seasonal or forced moves. We can say that sled dogs died in large numbers during this period, often in distressing circumstances. Some were culled by policy, some by hunger, some because their owners were told or felt that they had no future in the new settlements they were being steered toward. We can say that graves were opened, shifted, tilted, and sometimes left looking wrong. Permafrost is restless. Missionaries and administrators moved bodies into fenced cemeteries. Relatives carried bones to be closer to new homes or safer ground. The dead, like the living, didn't always stay where southern maps put them. We can say that at least one outsider walked into that landscape of movement and disturbance, found an absence where they expected a presence, and felt a genuine chill. Everything beyond that, how many people, which specific lake, what exact sequence of discoveries, whether dogs and graves and an empty camp all coincided in one moment, or were stitched together from several, is where the ground gets soft. It matters how we talk about that uncertainty. Abandonment suggests people giving up, defeated by the land. Relocation suggests agency, or at least a traceable decision, even if it was pressured. Tragedy points to loss, starvation, sickness, a storm, a thin winter that hit one group harder than their neighbours. Rumour is what happens when pieces of all of those slip their moorings and drift, bumping into each other, forming a new shape that resembles each source but is faithful to none. The Anjikuni story almost certainly contains all four: some version of a moved camp, some version of hardship, some version of misinterpretation, and then decades of rumour, drifting farther and farther from the shore of whatever actually happened. The difficulty is baked into the setting. The Arctic erases tracks quickly. Snow fills footprints, wind scatters canoe marks on a beach, ice shifts, and carries away any trace of where someone once travelled. Wooden buildings sag and disappear into the muskeg. Oral histories live in people, and when enough of those people are pushed or schooled or shamed into silence, whole chapters can go quiet in a single generation. At the same time, the environment conspires with our imaginations. A blown-out cluster of snow houses under a dim sky already looks like a movie set. A few overturned pots and a silent dog line can feel more like a deliberate message than the messy leftovers of a rushed departure. The line between mystery and weather plus history gets very thin. That's what makes stories like Anjikuni so powerful and so treacherous. They sit at the intersection of real environmental danger, real colonial policy, and a human urge to turn unease into narrative. We sense that something went wrong there, that people were hungry or ordered to move or caught between ice and authority, and instead of facing those slow, uncomfortable causes, we summon cleaner ones: vanishing, abduction, curses. The land, meanwhile, keeps its own counsel. It doesn't archive motives. It just absorbs footprints and returns to silence. So there are things we will probably never know. We may never pin down exactly which settlement inspired the earliest version of the tale. We may never match a name to the trapper with any real confidence. We may never know whether the graves he saw were naturally exposed or intentionally opened, whether the dogs had been killed mercifully or left in desperation, whether the families he expected to find there had already settled in a government post 100 miles away, wondering if he'd be angry when he showed up and they weren't where he thought they should be. What we can choose, though, is how we sit with that gap. We can treat it as an invitation to pile on more sensational layers, or we can treat it as a prompt to listen harder, to Inuit historians, to local elders, to the quieter archival traces of relocations and bad winters, and decisions made in distant offices that emptied real homes. If you're watching this from the north, or if your family has stories about camps abandoned, dogs shot, graves moved, I'd genuinely like to hear what you're willing to share. Not to mine it for spookiness, but to set it alongside this legend and see where they meet or contradict each other. Drop your thoughts in the comments, especially if you have local knowledge or recommended sources. And wherever you are in the world, Nunavut, Newfoundland, Norway, New Zealand, let me know where you're listening from. These stories ripple very differently depending on which shore you're standing on. If you found this exploration useful or thought-provoking, please do take a second to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. It helps more than you might think, and it tells the mysterious but very real YouTube algorithm that careful, nuanced history is worth showing to other people. If you're curious about deep-time mysteries, the kind written not in newspapers but in bones and DNA, I've also put together a book about prehistoric secrets and the bottlenecks and near misses that shaped our species. You can read more about it and pick up a copy at sleepytimehistory.com. In the end, Anjikuni is less about a single vanished village and more about how we, as listeners, respond when we meet an empty place. Do we fill it with monsters, or with the harder, slower work of understanding the people who once called it home? That, at least, is a mystery we get to decide.